I look, I see it. Even to the point where people call, especially the journalistic class, have this kind of homoerotic attitude to people like Boris Johnson, where we call him Boris, as if he was the school prefect, and I've got to do this to him. It's disgusting, absolutely revolting.
I'm not sure I can accept the journalistic class sort of doffing their caps to Boris Johnson. I'm going to open it, if I can, by asking each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Tim, because you might be best prepared, and it'll give everyone else a chance to think about it, for your sort of utopian vision at this moment in time. You know, throw yourself forward 15 years, 20 years, even 50 years. What is it that you would like to see Britain as? What is your vision of Britain?
My vision of Britain is a country which is completely food independent, is completely energy independent, is got a muscular localism where education is the centerpiece of what we do, and where the current democratic system has broken down so much that we have a number of parties representing things, and the centre of government in London is actually pretty meaningless because each of the regions will have a power and ability to have agency over itself.
But you are an achiever, not just a dreamer. And all of that sounds extremely utopian. I know I'm the one who threw the word in there, but how possible is it for that vision to come into practice?
Well, we do stuff. I mean, I could take you within 1,000 meters of where we're sitting. I can take you to a hole in the ground that's 5.3 kilometers deep and give you a temperature of 187 degrees, and we could do that across this country. With solar and with wind together, we could become completely renewable. The question is whether we have a political class that has the bravery to say, we're going to borrow from the future, so there is a future that's worth having. And we just need to do that sort of stuff. So that's why John and I came up with this idea. In fact, I ought to say, it's his idea, and I said I'd like to be part of it.
So how much is anthropy, to your mind, a sort of antidote to the political inertia on some of these big issues?
I'm glad you used the word inertia, at least it began with IN. I think the world is ours to make, and I'm not a holy roller. I actually believe that most of the people who are alive are really good people, but people aren't telling good stories which enable us to collaborate in such a way that we can get the best value out of us. I really mean that, and I think most people feel the same.
Sarah, let me turn to you. I know that you're here in part, I suppose, to represent the voice of business, and the idea of business and vision for the future that doesn't merely mean profit is something that some of us might struggle with. So perhaps fill me in on your vision.
So I started talking about profit and purpose collectively a little while ago, and various people used to come up to me and say, well, you can't have both. And I think that's absolute rubbish. One leads to the other, and particularly if I build on what Tim said, I think the way people are thinking now and the way people are behaving now and what the vision that people want for the future, I think the vast majority of people get this, and they recognise that businesses that are purposeful and doing the right thing, they'll attract more clients, they'll attract more talent. A huge amount of the talent coming through now wants business to behave this way. So I think we have to break this idea that these things are at odds with each other and make it part of the same thing. But sorry, no.
No, I was just going to ask because, again, as with Tim's vision, absolutely in terms of, you know, what people would like to hear, that very much chimes. But how do you bring business round to not putting profit first? I mean, you know, the voting public in this country are currently in a situation where they're looking at the incredible profits that are being made by energy firms at a time when their bills are escalating to non-payable levels. And the idea that business has some kind of big-hearted vision for all of our collective future is quite a hard one to stomach.
Well, it is, and the danger is that a few individual businesses can go out, fall on their swords, and if everybody else doesn't follow, then we end up looking, quite frankly, stupid. So there's got to be a level of education, there needs to be a level of incentivisation. If I come back to Tim's point about government, our party political system is utterly broken. We need a long-term and a collaborative vision for Britain where business and politics comes together. Partly there will need to be regulation and incentivisation to get businesses to do things. We saw in the pandemic the change that can be made when we have to, and that's the kind of thing we need to do now. We need that kind of imperatives to bring us all together. And if I may, forgive me, I have children. Anybody know Finding Nemo? I appreciate this may not be what we normally talk about on Times Radio, but there's a point...
Oh, no, I think we often do,
okay,
actually.
okay,
It's a big favourite in my house, too.
So, remember the point at the end, all the fish are in that big net having been switched up, and Nemo goes into the net, and everybody says, don't do it, Nemo. And he said, we can break this, we can beat this. And he says to the fish, swim down, swim together. And all the fish start swimming in the same direction, and they break the net. That's my vision for Britain. We all need to swim together in the same direction.
But is that possible with the economic model that we have? You know, we're a capitalist society. Is it possible within the economic model that we currently, you know, abide?
So I think we need a new form of capitalism, but I do still believe in capitalism with the right incentives and the right economic fiscal policy that's joined up to do more than one thing at once. You know, we could drive fantastic green energy technology if the right incentives were put behind it. If we tell business, and unfortunately some of this will have to come centrally, that certain things have to be removed by a set point in time, it will happen. So it is going to need some big brother intervention, but it's also going to need the right mindset and the right collaborative mindset. If you've ever come across the prisoner's dilemma, abundance mentality, it can be proven that we can all win if we do things together, but it's doing it together and having a longer term perspective.
Oh, I like the idea of us all winning. That's definitely a utopian prospect. Carol, can I bring you in now? I know you spent, I mean, you've done many things, and you are the Chief Executive of Quorum, but I know you spent the last year working on the People Pillar, which is sort of a collective of organisations looking at quality of life for the next generation. What sort of experience has that been, and how has that shaped your vision of a future Britain?
Well, I might start that at the end and then come to the question, if I forgive me for that. My vision for the future of Britain is that the principles of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child are actually honoured.
And in what way do you feel they're not?
Well, for example, children are still experiencing violence, destitution, and adult harm. Then voices are not heard. The resource that is applied for our next generation is completely mismatched to the scale of need and to the future needs of the nation. So if we look out to 20, 40, 60 years, the people who are going to make that future are already with us. They are our children. And we definitely know that we can affect the kinds of change that is needed if we have a new type of social contract of the same kind, perhaps, that we might look back to the cataclysm of the Second World War and the ways in which that galvanised complete change in social structures and attitudes. And Thomas Coram, who founded Coram in 1739, was an individual who challenged all of the orthodoxies of the day to create what is today the dedicated charity sector to rescue children who were abandoned on the streets of London. So that legacy is huge. People like Tim and John in particular, who have galvanised Anthropy, they symbolise the ways in which leadership can create the environment in which such shifts are possible, as was also being talked about there. So what does Anthropy mean to me? What is working with my colleagues, David, Ben and Nicola in particular on the People Pillar? We need to have a clarity of vision on what kind of society we want. It cannot be a society in which children are still abused, neglected, and abandoned. It cannot be a society in which there is a postcode lottery of opportunity. So if we are going down through a regional process, we have to ensure that that's just not replicated in regions, as well as between regions.
So I mean, again, these are all ideals that I think all of us would aspire to. How practically can they be addressed? How can we change those things? Because I don't think there's a person in this room or in this country who wouldn't say, yes, we need to protect the rights of children. Yes, we need to give them a future. But how are we failing specifically, and what do we need to do in order to bring that to fruition?
Well, I think how we're failing specifically is failing to recognise the ways in which resources need to be redistributed. It doesn't really matter which issue it is that we're addressing. The financial incentives, because we are human beings, do need to be aligned with the goals that we wish to achieve. And you need a long-term perspective. You need organisations who can sustain and develop change, as well as powerful individuals who can catalyse that change. So I think all of the themes have been coming up in what has already been said. The how is actually the way, is the key question, not only the what. And certainly the timescales in which change needs to be effected, they are not the life cycle of a minister at any point, nor even a government. They are the timescale of a nation. And that is something that we need to be recalibrating with cross-party, if we're still in a party system, cross-party alignments behind key goals, the Sustainable Development Goals.
In terms of politicians, you know, who, let's face it, do bring in laws and have the power to change things, how would you rate the quality at present, and I'm not just talking about the party in government, but generally in terms of ambition and vision and drive for change, rather than occupying positions?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. There are always individuals of talent, commitment and capability, and our generation is no different from any other. So we need to look at the ways in which we make it possible for our leaders and our policymakers to lead and govern, as well as actually expressing views about whether they do or don't come up to some standards that very few of us actually achieve ourselves. These conversations need to shift to the conversations of purposeful endeavour by our society as a collective, and we need to look at the ways in which the political processes are enabled to develop, because we have created them. We have created them, not they have created them. So actually I think there is a really important agenda here around mobilising a collective consciousness on what we are prepared to achieve. And we have to move beyond me into us. We have to move from us and them into we.
Actually, I'm going to turn to you, John, and ask you a question before I get your vision out, which is just, you know, what Carol was saying there very much seems to suggest that it's up to us to incentivize politicians by showing them what matters to us. And at the moment, their short-term policies are very much predicated on what they think are going to gain votes.
Yes, and I think that goes back actually to the whole concept and the original idea of anthropy. So I have to take you back to 18 months. We were at the end of the first year of COVID, the first year of lockdowns, etc., which now seems a long time ago. But I sat there just as an individual and thought, this is the hardest thing that my country in my lifetime has been hit with, both in terms of its impact on society and its impact on the economy. And we have no idea the effect that that's going to have. This was halfway through, effectively, those 2 years. But I thought if we are going to build back better, and people were starting to think of that term, and I thought we can only do that if a number of things are done differently. One of those things is we have to get out of this short-term cycle. So we have created a society, and we're all responsible for this. We demand things instantly. We're looking for media. You know, the media has a cycle that everybody pampers to, you know, with all due respect. Politicians then look at the next sound.
Sorry, I've got to go.
No, but you know, I mean, we're all responsible for that, because we have this appetite for everything coming very quick and very fast. But where is the long-term vision of Britain? Where is the thinking that, yes, actually, we have to have cross-party agreement, because certain things to be effective need to be passed from government to government, let alone even within, you know, I mean, how many prime ministers have we had, for example? We have to have consistency if we're going to achieve some of the things that everybody's spoken about here.
But how do you get that sort of consistency? Let's say in the areas that really matter, particularly at the moment, I would put education and the NHS probably in that, or health in general in that basket. You know, if you have a change every time government comes in, indeed every time a minister changes at the moment, you know, how do you stop that system working like that and get it working in a much more creative and long-term way?
Well, to build on what everybody else has said, actually, I think one of the things is that we cannot just tick a box, send a few people to Westminster and think, well, that's it, my job's done, my responsibility is done, it's now their problem. It's not, it's our problem. So business needs to step up and look into where it's operating and think, how do we reach into schools and bring our support into our local communities and care about the children in the way that Carol talked about, use the purpose sort of agenda that Sarah talked about. You know, we need long-term business leaders to think, actually, I'm not going to invest in a business and exit in 4 years' time, and I want that bringing. We need to invest in the sorts of sustainability projects that Tim has spoken about, which may not bring a financial return for 20 years. So we need to shift our own thinking. It's not about the instant gain. It's actually about what we're trying to create here. And I think this comes down also, if I may, all of these very hard issues that we have to face. But one of the things that really concerned me in that point where I was thinking of anthropy was that we have become such a divisive society. You know, people sort of identify what they're against so often rather than what they're for. People will not listen. I mean, people know I put out the fact, not that I'm a keynote speaker here, I'm a keynote listener. I want to listen and be open to other people's ideas and not think that just because I think something, it's got to be right. Because I think we're talking the character of Britain. You cannot have a vision for the future of Britain unless you can define the character of it. And, you know, frankly, you know, I think that there are things through social media and other things, and politicians are just as bad as everybody else on wanting to ramp up the rhetoric about negativity in order to build their own base. We've got to get away from that if we're going to have a long-term vision.
And yet, you're saying we're talking on, in the middle, really, of a migrant crisis where you've got a Home Secretary talking about an invasion of people coming to our shores and so on. I mean, I wonder, Carol, how you respond to that sort of politicking and playing to an audience.
Well, Thomas Coram would be turning in his grave at the thought that children were drowning in the Channel. And I'm afraid my position would be one of principle. Children are never an immigration issue. They are an issue of collective responsibility to the well-being of our child. So Coram is a specialist in immigration issues for children. There is no doubting that there is enormous distress and pain and fear that is driving people into these situations. And we have to put compassion back at the heart of the ways in which we deal with migration. Let us remember that in the period in the Second World War, when the invasion took place in France, there was a 10 million movement of people within that one nation. So these challenges have been seen before, they can be met before. Again, if society is prepared to be inclusive in its nature. And we cannot constantly act like King Canute, trying to hold back a tide with ever more complex bureaucratic processes that fail to recognise the human distress at the heart of what is driving these things.
I mean, a lot of this, John, as you were saying, comes down to people coming together and making clear what their baseline is, what their demands are. But we also, I presume, need to improve the quality of political discourse and our politicians. How do we do that? How do we make the job of being in government actually appealing to the right sort of people?
Well, I mean, I've met a lot of politicians, and when you meet them individually, they're all very good and decent people, and they've gone into politics with the right motivations. But somehow, in that pit that is Westminster and in that village, something happens. And I don't know what it is, but there becomes this sharpness to it all, where I think they forget actually why they're there, what they're there to represent. But that means, as I said before, we have to make sure that they're reminded all the time. This means that business needs to lobby not just for the self of their own business or their sector, but lobby on behalf of the effect of things on their employees. Because we need to keep sending that message. And also we need people generally to play a more active part in civil society. Become a magistrate, give blood, become a local councillor. These are things that we can take ownership of. These are things that we can create influence in our own communities. So that's the sort of direction, actually. Individuals coming together, and I love the analogy there of the fish. We do know that things can happen. I mean, I look into this audience alone and I see the people who have come today. Anthropy isn't just my idea, it might have been an idea, but it's actually because people have bought into something and they have brought it, they have made it, and will make it happen.
Tim, it's interesting what John's saying there about children and the importance of them growing up to feel that they have an investment in the community and in the society in which they live. What do you think we're doing wrong and need to put right in terms of making our children's, the next generation's education one that's fit for purpose and gives them that sense of investment?
Could I start with a simpler question, please?
No, I'm sorry. You'll have to go with the one you've been given.
Can I use one of your tropes, which is to answer a different question that you should have asked me, which is this. I read an essay which was written for the Resurgence magazine Essay of the Year, and it was really interesting. It was from a teacher who wanted to work out how you could create attention and care, and a wasp flew into the room. And he decided to call the wasp Sammy. And from the moment that the wasp had a name, no one wanted to kill it. And I think that's a really profound thing, because I think what you find, remember that horrid picture of the child on the Greek island dying? As long as we use words like immigrants and invasion, you dehumanize. The moment you realize someone has a name and a brother or a sister or a parent or a friend, suddenly it changes. And I think we need to talk to the better sides of ourselves and look down our noses at people who seek to sloganeer.
But the trouble with the looking down our noses is that just contributes, doesn't it, to the divisiveness, the sort of polarity that we're experiencing at the moment that we need to bring an end to. I mean, you could talk about Brexit, dare I even mention the B word, and look at how that whole campaign from both sides, one side completely lacking understanding perhaps of what other people were feeling, not necessarily justified feelings, but feelings nonetheless that provoked them into voting a certain way. So isn't that divisiveness the first thing that we need to actually be dealing with?
Of course, and I consider myself slapped with a wet mackerel.
That's what I'm here for.
This shows when you're in that public gaze, boy, this is why none of us become politicians, because you come and you say things like that and we feel small and horrible. No, I think at the risk of exaggerating, I think humanity is common to all of us, and we live predominantly now in a secular age. Whether there is formal religion or not, it is predominantly secular. And I think there is an enormous hunger, I know certainly young people who come here, to find some spiritual succor from something. And I think the natural world and a generosity of spirit is part of that, genii, whatever you call it, that's in that smoking vase. So, this isn't rocket science. It really isn't. Being nice is quite easy, and it's amazing.
No, I know, but I think that there's a lot of people up and down the country in real hardship at the moment, actually not able to pay their bills, struggling to find places for their children in school or decent schools, struggling, in so many ways. And one has to be really careful to not make it a sort of kumbaya message, because people need tangible things to grasp. And how do you marry a big vision for the future that we can all, applaud and agree with actually tangibly bringing people along who are in great hardship?
Yeah, but I don't do kumbaya at all. Not at all. Your point is absolutely brilliant. Why was 1948 so special? Because enough people of upper class background and working class background had been fighting side by side, dying side by side, and they realized the common humanity. That's when you saw the whole thought that made the NHS arrive, a whole approach to an education system for everybody arise. We need that kind of energy. To be honest, we are a completely class-ridden nation, but a kind of approach where none of us dare to talk about it anymore. It's everywhere I look, I see it. Even to the point where people call, especially the journalistic class, have this kind of homoerotic attitude to people like Boris Johnson, where we call him Boris, as if he was the school prefect, and I've got to do this to him. It's disgusting, absolutely revolting.
I'm not sure I can accept the journalistic
I'll
class
pass it on now.
sort of doffing their caps to Boris Johnson. I think, in fact, it was the journalists that held Boris Johnson to account and continued to remind the voting public that he'd broken COVID rules. So I think it just, this is the trouble, isn't it? That one sets out with the kind of positive vision for Britain, for the future, but in the end, we end up accentuating again all of the divisive things that have us in the situation that we're in now. Sarah.
So if I can try and arbitrate here.
Okay, it's going to be a dust-up.
No, on a serious point, I think we have to have somebody said a phrase that I heard recently about having a really big tent. Are you bringing everybody into the debate? I think we need a flipping marquee, actually. We have got to talk to everybody. I'm like you. I'm still frustrated by Brexit, but we have to respect the opinion of just over half.
I'm neutral on it, obviously.
Yeah, sorry, of course you are. So we do need to bring everybody into the debate and the dialogue. To your point on class system, the Alfred Doolittle quote comes to mind from George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, where he says to Alfred Doolittle, the dustman, "Have you no morals, man?" He says, "I can't afford them." We can have the best vision in the world, but unless the way we approach fiscal policy, economics, and everything else in this country will help everybody come to the party. A recent thing by the House of Lords says a quarter of the tonnage we need to reduce in our carbon offset can be sorted if we all move to electronic vehicles. Great. How do we help most people afford an electronic vehicle? So it's got to be targeted, and we need to acknowledge, to your point, that there are an awful lot of people that can't afford to do some of this stuff, so we have to bring them in, and we have to find a way of working together to do it. Sorry, John.
John, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to sort of add something in on the basis that this issue around politics and all the rest of it, I don't think you can create practical, sustainable policy unless you know where you're heading. So it's as simple as that when it comes down to it. So looking at the needs that we have, you have to have short-term reactions to desperate need. And we have to get the best of our minds around that. I mean, one of our companies that are here is Greg's the Bakers. Years ago, they were going into schools and doing breakfast clubs. Years and years ago, because they saw there was a need in where they were operating. And we need everybody to step up and take that responsibility. But what might be an interesting observation was that over the last year, I've spoken to literally hundreds of leaders from all sectors. But when it comes to politicians, I've written to probably over 60 front bench and back benchers, all parties, and invited them to be here. We have a couple attending. But what's really sad to my basis is that those that I actually spoke to and didn't just get a written reply, one attitude prevailed. And that attitude, believe it or not, was we have enough forums for people to talk. We have enough ways to represent opinions. To be frank, I don't think we need another. And that came through on 4 or 5 conversations that I had. If that attitude prevails, then we're never going to break down this. So we have to do something differently.
Though one could also play the devil's advocate and go, maybe we do have an awful lot of forums,
Yeah.
and maybe we aren't seeing enough action.
And my argument to that, even though I didn't want to get into an argument, my point was this. If that's the case, then why have 1,100 people turning out for Anthropy from business, senior business leaders, coming to a location I chose, not because it was convenient, because it was of consequence. Because if we have an example of long-term vision, of sustainable practices, of transforming and educating people around the future of our planet, etc., then it has to be Eden. This is a world-class place. So it wasn't good enough to put it on in London so people could just pop in, make their speech and leave. They had to make a serious decision to commit to come down here and come into a crucible of different minds. And I applaud all of those that have done that, and I give them all credit, but I was very saddened that not more people saw the opportunity.
Carol, I know you wanted to come in, but I'm not sure on which of the many points that we've just been ranging around.
I might touch on several of them. I think the first thing is that we need an appreciative inquiry that actually moves away from the toxic language of trial by Twitter or whatever else terminology one might want to use. This is not about levelling down opinion to some sort of job lot issue. This is about a collective endeavour. The second thing I want to say is that within that context, because Tim mentioned it, is schools do a pretty good job. Actually, they do a pretty good job. So let's start by saying our schools are doing a really good job. Now, how else do we need to support them to do what children might need for the next generation? The digital-first generation lives its life in public. We know what the issues are, but we are probably the single least prepared older generation in history to help our children to prepare for that. And there have to be certain principles in our society that we collectively commit to, as in 1948, as in universal education for all children, as in universal school meal for children. We cannot have, when rationing was introduced in the war, children's diet in this country improved. And this is one of the collective commitments that we need to make. And it applies equally to your point about families that are struggling, doing 3 jobs, trying to keep afloat. There has to be a level below which we in our society will not accept that people fall. Whatever the reasons, whatever the consequences, it isn't a matter of blame or judgment. It's a matter of our society's commitment. And finally, listen to what matters to our next generation, because we won't be here. So if you look at the Brexit conundrum, of course we all will respect the voting mandate, but look beneath it. 80% of young people aged 16 to 25 voted to remain. And this is a really important thing, however inconvenient it is to us in the older generation. As Tim says, those motivations in the clinic for children today, in clinical sessions, you have the environment, you have a lack of attention to young people's concerns and agenda manifesting itself in illness. And we need, of course, we have mechanisms by which, in theory, everybody can be heard, or at least everybody can shout. But is anybody listening?
Mm. Very, very good points. Tim, I did try and talk to you about education before, and I'm going to have another go at it, because you did sit on the Times Education Committee, and I know that you have very strong ideas about whether we're future-proofing the next generation in terms of the education they're getting, particularly perhaps at university level. But I mean, you've also talked quite eloquently about the introduction of a natural history GCSE, although the Times Education Committee, I know we're perhaps leaning more towards getting rid of GCSEs.
It was unanimous. Every one of the commissioners wanted to abolish GCSEs. Every one of them thought that the education system of our country had been created by the Treasury to be able to measure outputs that were measurable rather than to give us an education. And I don't think that's a view that probably anyone in this room would disagree with. The GCSE in natural history will now be a GCSE, but it will morph into, it'll permeate every aspect of the education system. But, one of the ministers who stood against it said, we haven't got the teachers to teach it. It's a bit like saying money is what stops nurses making hospitals clean. Yes. No, you're a teacher, you teach, you understand this stuff. So I'm really excited about that. I see natural history as being the grounder of lightning to all the different studies which enable us to see a natural philosophy, a series of cycles that work together. You know my personal views about universities. I think
do to our listeners.
All right, gosh, you're really trying to. This may be my last day on earth. I love many of the individuals at universities and think that almost every university in our country has become a corporation run by a chief executive, obsessed by making money at every corner, and is not interested in doing things in the national interest. I believe that the output of our universities shows a poverty which is breathtaking for the money that we, the citizens, pay to go into it. I also think that when I look at the graduates that come to me for jobs, I'm actually horror-struck by the fact that they may know about the outside wing flap of a fruit bat, but their understanding of where certain countries in the world might be, or anything that is a generalized worldview, shows an absolute poverty which is just, it makes you want to cry, because they're obviously such smart people, but they're not being, the conductor of this feast is not doing their job. And I think we really need to look at universities. I read a book called Extraterrestrial earlier this year, which some of you may have seen, by Professor Avi Loeb, the head of astrophysics at Harvard. And what he said was astonishing. He said, I believe that almost every scientist on planet Earth has Galileo as a hero, and no one recognizes that they've actually turned into the administrative class that wanted to burn him, because the establishment has become so enshrined in wanting to make sure that the received wisdoms they have, they play to the same gallery. I think it's a political problem as well as it is an educational problem, but I think that's why John set up Anthropy. And I'm sorry if I misspoke earlier, but I think it is a spiritual journey that everybody wants to go on, but it's spiritual with a small s, so anybody who's embarrassed by religion doesn't have to worry about it.
Sarah, let's talk about spiritual with a small s. How do you convince business, which is what you've been talking about, and this will probably be our concluding question today. How do you encourage business to embrace spiritual on any level at all? Because I'm sure that I'm not the only person who is feeling at least a small bit cynical about the idea of harnessing business to come on board and to help us, save society as we know it.
So, yes, I see all of that. First of all, I'm an accountant, so measure the right things. So to build on Tim's point, we have whole systems set up around the measures that we've created, whether it's in education or in business or in our markets. So if we start to measure the right things, even GDP is not the right measure for the sort of thing that we're trying to deal with at the moment. So shifting what we measure and how we measure it is important. If you think about capitalism, obviously it's built on creating long-term value. We just need to move the goalposts out of it. And private equity are already starting to do this. They're now looking at their return on investment over a longer time frame. So there is a bit of a shift going, but you have to win the hearts and minds. The hearts bit is relatively easy, especially if you get them, to Carol's point, to talk to the younger generation, because they'll see that that's what their people want. They'll see that we'll recruit better people if we have a message, if we have a story, if we have something we believe in. So you can piece together a load of evidence, but there's no substitute for me for action. And to John's point, being a keynote listener, I think we need to be keynote actioners. I'm not even saying activist, I'm saying actioners. It's maybe a new word, it probably doesn't exist. But that's the whole point, isn't it? We need to do things differently, and we all need to leave from here and throw our own little pebble to create a ripple of change. And seeing is believing. I know that's a phrase linked to business in the community, but if people see that things can be done differently and business can be successful whilst doing all the right things as well, it will convince other businesses, because ultimately somebody has to go there first, and we know the 80% will follow, as long as we have the right tax incentives, the right long-term economic policy, and everything that supports people to do the right thing.
Well, I think we've kicked off Anthropy rather well. We've come up with a whole new term, key actioners. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. And thank you very much to Tim Smitt, to Sarah Walker-Smith, to Carol Homden, and to John O'Brien for joining me for this opening panel, as it were.